It was a cool autumn evening in the quiet suburban town of Willow Creek when the unthinkable happened in one of its most luxurious mansions. Harold Montgomery, a 55-year-old self-made millionaire, was a man of prestige and respect. His empire spanned multiple businesses, from real estate to tech startups, making him one of the wealthiest men in the state. Despite his thriving career, Harold's personal life was far from ideal. His marriage to the much younger and beautiful Clara Montgomery, though seemingly perfect on the outside, had been crumbling for years. The couple's only son, Timothy, a shy 6-year-old, was the only reason they had maintained the semblance of a happy family. Enter Sarah, the new nanny, a 25-year-old college dropout with striking good looks and a mysterious past. With her blonde hair and innocent smile, she quickly became Timothy's favorite. But as the weeks went by, it wasn't just Timothy she was charming. Harold, who was often home late from business meetings, found himself increasingly captivated by Sarah's youthful exuberance and easygoing nature. It started innocently enough, a few casual conversations over coffee, then dinner invitations when Clara was away visiting her family. Harold, bored of his strained marriage and enticed by the thrill of something new, found himself drawn to Sarah in a way he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't long before what started as innocent flirting turned into a passionate affair. But secrets have a way of unraveling, especially when one becomes reckless. Clara, initially oblivious to the growing closeness between her husband and the nanny, began noticing subtle changes. Harold's usual disinterest in family activities was replaced by a sudden eagerness to stay home. He became more attentive, even buying her gifts, a stark contrast to his usual distant demeanor. Suspicious, Clara decided to investigate. One evening, while Harold was out, Clara searched through his belongings and found a hidden phone in his study. It was filled with messages between Harold and Sarah, detailing their illicit encounters and promises of a future together. Clara's heart sank. Her suspicions were confirmed. She realized her husband had been cheating on her with the very woman she had trusted with their child. Consumed by rage and heartbreak, Clara confronted Harold the next morning. The argument that ensued was brutal. Harold, caught off guard, attempted to lie his way out, but Clara was relentless. She accused him of betrayal, of tearing their family apart. But Harold, rather than showing remorse, lashed back, claiming that Clara had driven him away with her constant nagging and cold demeanor. The fight ended with Clara storming out of the house, vowing to take Timothy and leave him for good. But Clara wasn't the only one on edge. Sarah, who had been eavesdropping on their argument, knew her future was in jeopardy. She had no intention of losing the luxurious lifestyle Harold provided. She needed to secure her position in his life, but with Clara still in the picture, that seemed impossible. Days passed in tense silence. Harold avoided Clara, who in turn avoided him. Sarah grew more anxious with each passing day. Then an idea began to form in her mind, a dark, desperate plan to eliminate the obstacle in her path once and for all. One night, Sarah crept into Harold's study and found the spare keys to Clara's car. She knew Clara had planned a late-night drive to clear her head, something she did whenever she was overwhelmed. Sarah waited until Clara was asleep, then quietly slipped the keys back into her bag after taking a small item from Harold's toolkit, a razor-thin wire. The following morning, Clara's body was discovered by a passerby on a quiet, deserted road near the edge of town. Her car had veered off the road and crashed into a tree, but it wasn't the impact that killed her. The police found a thin, nearly invisible wire wrapped tightly around her neck, cutting deep into her skin. Clara Montgomery had been strangled to death. As news of Clara's murder spread, the entire town was in shock. The once golden couple of Willow Creek was shattered forever. Harold, devastated and visibly shaken, appeared on the local news, pleading for any information that could lead to his wife's killer. Sarah, on the other hand, stayed in the background, playing the role of a grieving nanny, trying to hold the family together in their time of loss. But the police were suspicious. The crime was too clean, too calculated. They began their investigation, starting with those closest to Clara. The investigation into Clara Montgomery's murder quickly gained momentum. The small police force of Willow Creek, unaccustomed to handling high-profile cases, enlisted the help of the state police. Lead investigator Detective Mark Davis, known for his keen instincts and methodical approach, was put in charge. Detective Davis began by examining the details of Clara's life and those closest to her. He started with Harold, who appeared devastated but cooperative. Harold provided a detailed account of their relationship problems, the recent confrontation about the affair, and his regret over the whole situation. He claimed to have been at home the night of Clara's death, which Sarah corroborated, stating she had been in the house as well, taking care of Timothy. Davis found Sarah's demeanor curious. She seemed more composed than he expected from someone supposedly close to the family. He made a mental note to revisit her statements later, but for now, he focused on gathering concrete evidence. The crime scene offered little to go on. There were no signs of a struggle in Clara's car, and the wire used was a common type found in most hardware stores. However, the precise manner in which it was used suggested premeditation and a certain level of skill. This wasn't a crime of passion, but a calculated murder. Days turned into weeks as the investigation progressed. Detectives sifted through Clara's personal life, interviewing friends, colleagues, and anyone who might have had a motive to harm her. The focus, however, remained on Harold and Sarah. Despite their alibis, something didn't add up. Then came the breakthrough. The forensic team found traces of fingerprints on the thin wire used in the murder. Most were smeared, but one partial print was clear enough to be analyzed. The results came back, and the print belonged to Harold. When confronted, Harold was shocked. He claimed to have no idea how his print got there and insisted on his innocence. Davis suspected that Harold might be hiding more than he let on, but without direct evidence linking him to the crime scene that night, they couldn't arrest him. Sarah, meanwhile, was being closely watched. Detectives noted her behavior, how she seemed nervous whenever the topic of Clara's death came up, how she always glanced at Harold before answering any questions. She was hiding something, but what? Davis decided it was time to dig deeper into Sarah's past. He discovered that she had a history of being in relationships with older, wealthy men, all of which had ended abruptly. There were no criminal records, but a pattern of calculated manipulation emerged. Her former employers described her as charming and clever, but she always seemed to leave under mysterious circumstances, usually after getting involved with the men of the household. The detectives also found something even more incriminating. Sarah had made several purchases from an online store specializing in surveillance equipment. Among the items purchased was a small, discreet camera, which was later found hidden in Harold's study. This camera had recorded several conversations between Harold and Clara, including their final heated argument. The footage showed a distraught Clara accusing Harold of destroying their family and mentioning divorce. Harold was visibly angry, but what caught the detective's attention was the presence of Sarah in the background, quietly listening. After Clara stormed out, Sarah approached Harold, consoling him and suggesting that perhaps things would be better if Clara wasn't around to cause so much trouble. Harold didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Davis now had a clearer picture. He believed that Sarah, using her influence over Harold, might have orchestrated the murder, but without a direct link to her involvement, it would be hard to prove in court. He needed something more concrete, something that would tie Sarah directly to the crime. Davis returned to the wire. If Sarah had handled it, there must be traces of her DNA on it. He ordered a more thorough analysis, looking for any microscopic evidence that could link Sarah to the wire. Meanwhile, he also obtained a warrant to search her belongings. In Sarah's room, detectives found her laptop. They quickly discovered that she had been researching various methods of murder over the past few months. Search terms like untraceable poisons and how to stage a car accident appeared in her history. It was damning evidence, but still circumstantial. They needed something more definitive to make an arrest. Then they found what they were looking for. Hidden in a secret compartment at the back of her closet was a small box. Inside was a pair of latex gloves, a roll of the same wire used in the murder, and, most incriminating of all, a detailed handwritten plan of the murder. It outlined everything, from disabling Clara's car to the exact route she would take that night. It was clear that Sarah had planned everything meticulously. With this evidence in hand, Davis had what he needed. He arrested Sarah, who initially maintained her innocence but eventually broke down under the weight of the evidence against her. She confessed that she had orchestrated the murder, but she claimed Harold was involved too, that he knew everything and had even helped her plan it. Harold, upon hearing of Sarah's confession, denied everything. He claimed he had been manipulated, that he had no idea what Sarah had planned. The case now took a new turn, with both Harold and Sarah pointing fingers at each other. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers as the trial of Sarah Williams and Harold Montgomery began. The scandal had gripped the nation, a tale of betrayal, greed, and murder that seemed too twisted to be real. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution painted Sarah as a calculating femme fatale, while the defense tried to portray her as a victim manipulated by Harold's wealth and power. Prosecutor Jane Sinclair opened with a powerful statement, describing Sarah's deliberate actions to eliminate Clara. She outlined how Sarah had ingratiated herself into the family, seduced Harold, and coldly plotted the murder. She presented the evidence, the gloves, the wire, and most damning of all, the handwritten plan. The jury was shown the chilling details of the plan, step-by-step instructions on how to carry out the murder without leaving a trace. The prosecution argued that Sarah's greed and jealousy had driven her to kill Clara so she could secure her place in Harold's life and, more importantly, his fortune. Sarah's defense attorney, Michael Stern, countered by claiming that she had been coerced by Harold, who was the true mastermind. He argued that Harold, desperate to avoid losing his wealth in a divorce and embittered by Clara's rejection, had manipulated Sarah into carrying out his dark desires. Stern highlighted Harold's volatile temper, his affair with Sarah, and the incriminating messages on the secret phone as proof that Harold had pressured Sarah into committing the crime. Harold's attorney, David Cole, insisted that his client was innocent. He argued that Harold had been unaware of Sarah's intentions and had no involvement in the crime. Cole presented Harold as a flawed but decent man who had made a terrible mistake by getting involved with the wrong woman. He portrayed Sarah as a dangerous manipulator who had played on Harold's vulnerabilities for her own gain. As the trial proceeded, the prosecution presented a series of damning witnesses. Former acquaintances of Sarah testified about her pattern of latching onto wealthy men and then abruptly disappearing when things didn't go her way. One witness, a former employer, described how Sarah had a history of researching criminal cases and had even once joked about the perfect murder. But the most compelling testimony came from Detective Mark Davis. He walked the jury through the investigation step by step, detailing how they had pieced together the evidence against Sarah. The prosecution played the footage from the hidden camera in Harold's study, showing the heated argument between Harold and Clara, followed by Sarah's chilling suggestion that things might be better if Clara were gone. The room fell silent as the jury watched Sarah's calm demeanor, a stark contrast to the emotional outburst between the couple. The defense tried to discredit the video, arguing that it was taken out of context and that Sarah had only been trying to console Harold, but the damage was done. The image of Sarah as a cold, calculating woman was firmly planted in the minds of the jurors. Then came the turning point of the trial, the moment when Sarah took the stand. Dressed demurely and looking far younger than her 25 years, she began her testimony with tears in her eyes. She told the jury about her difficult upbringing, how she had been abandoned by her family and had to fend for herself. She painted herself as a woman who had made mistakes but had never meant to hurt anyone. She claimed that she had loved Harold and that he had promised to leave Clara for her. When he didn't, she felt trapped and used. Sarah confessed to planning the murder, but insisted it was under Harold's influence. She described how Harold had spoken often about his fear of losing his wealth in a divorce and how he had pressured her to do something about Clara. She even claimed that Harold had provided the wire and had shown her how to use it. It was a compelling story, and some members of the jury seemed to waver. But the prosecution wasn't done. In a surprise move, they called a rebuttal witness, Harold's former business partner, Alan Porter. Porter testified that Harold had confided in him about wanting a divorce, but had been worried about the impact on his business and reputation. He said Harold had spoken fondly of Clara and had never shown any signs of wanting her dead. The prosecution used this testimony to argue that Harold, while unfaithful, had no motive to kill his wife. As the trial drew to a close, both sides made their final pleas to the jury. The prosecution asked for a guilty verdict on all counts, emphasizing Sarah's calculated nature and the overwhelming evidence against her. The defense pleaded for leniency, portraying Sarah as a misguided young woman who had fallen under the spell of an older, more powerful man. The jury deliberated for 3 long days. Tensions were high as everyone waited for the verdict. When they finally returned, the courtroom was silent, save for the nervous whispers of reporters typing away on their phones. We find the defendant, Sarah Williams, guilty of first-degree murder. A collective gasp filled the room. Sarah collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. The judge ordered silence and continued reading. We find the defendant, Harold Montgomery, not guilty on all counts. Harold, visibly shaken, broke down in tears, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. He glanced over at Sarah, who was being restrained by bailiffs as she screamed, "You liar, you promised me!" In the end, Sarah was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Harold, despite being acquitted, faced public outrage and the collapse of his business empire. He lost custody of Timothy, who was placed in the care of Clara's parents. The mansion in Willow Creek was sold, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The town of Willow Creek would never forget the scandal that shattered its peace. Harold Montgomery, once a revered figure, became a cautionary tale of how wealth and power could lead to ruin. Sarah Williams, the young nanny whose ambition and jealousy led to murder, would spend the rest of her life behind bars, her dreams of wealth and luxury reduced to a cold, grey cell.